On 16 September 1922, in a secluded orchard in Franklin Township, near New Brunswick, New Jersey, the bodies of Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills were discovered lying beneath a crabapple tree. Hall was the rector of St. Rector, John the Evangelist Episcopal Church. Mills was a member of his choir. Both had been shot. Their deaths would ignite one of the most controversial murder cases of the decade. The discovery occurred shortly after sunrise. A local farmer's wife, accompanied by her cousin, approached the orchard after hearing persistent rumors that bodies had been found in the area. When they reached the grove, they saw two figures lying close together on the ground. Hall's body rested on its back. Mills lay beside him, partially turned toward him, her head near his arm. Letters were scattered nearby. Authorities were not immediately present. Word spread rapidly through nearby roads and farmhouses. Before law enforcement secured the scene, residents gathered in growing numbers. Some stepped close to the bodies. Others picked up and examined the letters. Footprints overlapped in the soft soil. Potential evidence was disturbed within hours of discovery. The physical arrangement of the victims suggested deliberate positioning. Hall had sustained a single gunshot wound to the head. Mills had been shot 3 times. Her throat had been cut, though medical examination would later determine the incision was not the cause of death. The wounds appeared to have been inflicted at close range. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall was 41 years old. Educated and formally trained, he had served as rector at St. John's since 1913. He was married to Frances Noel Hall, a member of a prominent New Brunswick family. The Stevens family, into which Frances had been born, held financial and social influence within the community. Eleanor Mills was 34 years old and married to James Mills, the sexton of St. John's Church. She participated actively in choir services and parish functions. In the months leading up to September 1922, rumors circulated that she and Reverend Hall were engaged in an intimate relationship. The letters found near Mills' body confirms those suspicions. Written in affectionate language and signed by Hall, they described private meetings and emotional attachment. Their presence at the scene was striking. Whether they had fallen accidentally or been placed intentionally would become a central question. Investigators sought to reconstruct the final movements of both victims. On the evening of 14 September 1922, Hall left his residence after dinner. He told his wife he intended to meet parish business associates. Mills also left her home that night, reportedly to attend choir-related matters. Neither returned. Initial examination of the orchard indicated no immediate signs of struggle beyond the wounds themselves. The rural setting, however, made it difficult to determine whether the meeting had been planned or coerced. The area was accessible by footpath and narrow road. It offered privacy without complete isolation. Attention quickly turned toward domestic motives. Frances Hall had long been aware of rumors concerning her husband's relationship with Mills. Witnesses later testified that arguments had occurred within the Hall household. Eleanor Mills' marriage to James Mills had also been strained, though less publicly. Speculation intensified when the social standing of Frances Hall's family became known beyond New Brunswick. Her brothers, Henry Stevens and William Stevens, were described as protective and fiercely loyal. Allegations surfaced that they had confronted Reverend Hall about the affair. The early handling of the scene complicated matters. By the time police conducted systematic documentation, crowds had already disturbed the orchard floor. Objects had been moved. The letters had been handled. Statements from early witnesses differed in detail regarding body positioning and sequence of discovery. Medical examination confirmed that both victims had been killed on the night of 14 September. Ballistics suggested a small-caliber firearm. No weapon was recovered at the scene. The case rapidly attracted national press coverage. Newspapers framed the story as a collision between religion and scandal. A respected clergyman and a choir singer, found dead together in a secluded grove, created a narrative that transcended local interest. Yet beneath the sensational headlines, the investigation faced structural weaknesses. Evidence was incomplete. The timeline relied heavily on witness accounts. No direct eyewitness to the shooting had come forward. Within days, suspicion centered not on unknown assailants but on individuals connected to the church and the families involved. The orchard, once an ordinary agricultural space, became a focal point for reporters and spectators alike. What had begun as a violent double homicide now carried broader implications. Reputation, class, morality, and institutional authority were intertwined from the outset. The case would not resolve quickly. Instead, it would unfold over 4 years, shaped as much by delay and spectacle as by evidence. The crabapple tree remained standing long after the bodies were removed, but by the end of September 1922, it had already become a symbol, not only of scandal, but of uncertainty that would shadow the proceedings for years to come. In the days following the discovery, investigators faced a compromised crime scene and a community already divided by rumor. The orchard in Franklin Township had not been secured immediately, and by the time systematic examination began, physical traces had been altered. Footprints overlapped. Letters had been handled. The original positioning of the bodies was described differently by early witnesses. These deficiencies would later weaken prosecutorial certainty. Medical examination established that both Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Mills had died from gunshot wounds inflicted on the night of 14 September 1922. Hall sustained a single gunshot wound to the head. Mills was shot 3 times. A cut to her throat appeared to have been inflicted after death. The weapon was believed to be a small-caliber revolver, though no firearm was recovered. Attention turned to motive. The letters found beside Eleanor Mills confirmed an intimate relationship between her and the rector. Written in affectionate language and signed by Hall, they referred to meetings and shared emotional attachment. Their presence at the orchard raised questions. Had they fallen from Mills' possession, or were they placed deliberately to expose the affair? Frances Noel Hall, the rector's wife, was questioned early. She acknowledged awareness of rumors, but denied knowledge of any meeting on the night of 14 September. She stated that her husband had left home after dinner and had not returned. Witnesses later testified that she had expressed distress over the relationship, though no direct threat was substantiated in initial statements. Frances's brothers Henry Stevens and William Stevens were also interviewed. Both denied involvement. Henry Stevens in particular was described by acquaintances as protective of family reputation. Reports circulated that he had confronted Hall in the past. No documented altercation was formally recorded in the immediate investigation, yet the possibility of confrontation lingered. James Mills, Eleanor's husband, became another focal point. He claimed ignorance of the depth of his wife's relationship with Hall. Observers described him as reserved and religious. Some accounts suggested he had previously confronted Eleanor over her association with the rector. However, no clear evidence tied him to the orchard that evening. Investigators sought to reconstruct the final hours. Telephone records were limited. Witnesses placed Hall in New Brunswick earlier in the evening of 14 September. Mills was last seen leaving her residence shortly before nightfall. It was assumed they met by arrangement, though no written plan was recovered beyond the letters themselves. As the weeks passed, the case did not produce arrests. Public interest, however, did not diminish. Newspapers emphasized the moral dimensions of the affair. Editorials speculated on jealousy and revenge. The involvement of a respected clergyman heightened scrutiny. By late 1922, inconsistencies in early witness accounts began to attract criticism. Some residents claimed to have heard gunshots on the night in question but had not reported them immediately. Others asserted they had seen unfamiliar figures near the orchard. These statements varied in detail and timing, complicating the timeline. For several years, the investigation appeared to stagnate. The absence of direct eyewitness testimony and the compromised scene hindered progress, yet the case remained unresolved in public memory. Periodic press articles revisited the scandal, particularly as the Stevens family maintained social standing within New Brunswick. In 1926, renewed efforts by state authorities led to a new grand jury inquiry. Prosecutors reviewed earlier testimony and sought additional witnesses. Allegations surfaced that Francis Hall had threatened Eleanor Mills prior to the murders. A former domestic employee claimed that members of the Stevens family had expressed anger toward Hall. The reliability of these late-emerging statements became central to the renewed investigation. Critics argued that memories had been shaped by years of publicity. Supporters contended that initial reluctance to testify had been influenced by local pressure. In September 1926, indictments were issued against Francis Hall, her brother Henry Stevens, her brother William Stevens, and their cousin Henry Carpenter. The charges alleged conspiracy and murder. The 4-year delay between the killings and the indictments immediately became a matter of public debate. The prosecution theory suggested that the Stevens family, motivated by humiliation and anger over the affair, had confronted Hall and Mills in the orchard. According to this view, the killings were intended both as retribution and as a restoration of family honor. The staged arrangement of letters was interpreted as symbolic exposure. Defense attorneys argued that the indictments were the product of speculation rather than evidence. They emphasized the absence of a murder weapon, the lack of direct eyewitness testimony, and the compromised state of the scene. They also questioned the credibility of witnesses who had altered or expanded their accounts over time. As preparations for trial began, media coverage intensified. Reporters framed the case as a conflict between social class and moral transgression. The prominence of the Stevens family drew attention to the possibility of influence within local institutions. Simultaneously, the reputations of Hall and Mills were scrutinized in detail. The case now shifted from investigative uncertainty to judicial confrontation. 4 individuals stood accused, yet the foundation of the prosecution rested largely on circumstantial evidence and contested testimony. The orchard, disturbed within hours of discovery, continued to cast doubt over what might otherwise have been clearer. By November 1926, the Hall-Mills case had evolved from a scandal within a parish to a statewide legal proceeding. The central question was no longer whether Hall and Mills had been murdered. That fact was undisputed. The question was whether the state could establish beyond reasonable doubt who had committed the crime. The escalation was complete. The trial would determine whether suspicion, amplified over 4 years, could withstand the discipline of courtroom scrutiny. The Hall-Mills trial opened on 3rd of November 1926 in Somerville, New Jersey, after a change of venue was granted to reduce potential prejudice in New Brunswick. The courtroom was heavily attended. Reporters filled designated seats. Spectators gathered daily. The case, already 4 years old, entered its decisive phase. The defendants were Frances Noel Hall, her brother Henry Stevens, her brother William Stevens, and their cousin Henry Carpenter. William Stevens' charges were dismissed early in the proceedings for lack of sufficient evidence, narrowing the focus to 3 accused individuals. The prosecution's case rested primarily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. No murder weapon had been recovered. No direct eyewitness to the shooting had come forward at the time of the crime. The state therefore relied on reconstruction and motive. Central to the prosecution's argument was the alleged anger of Francis Hall toward Eleanor Mills. Witnesses testified that Francis had been distressed by the affair. A former household employee claimed that Francis had spoken harshly about Mills in the months preceding the killings. The prosecution suggested that humiliation and resentment provided motive. The Stevens brothers were portrayed as protective and willing to defend family honor. Testimony indicated that Henry Stevens had confronted Reverend Hall in the past. However, no formal complaint or documented altercation was presented as evidence of a violent plan. The state's most controversial witness was Jane Gibson, known locally as the Pig Woman. Gibson testified that on the night of 14 September 1922, she had been near the orchard searching for a missing pig. She claimed to have heard gunshots and observed figures in the darkness. According to her testimony, she saw individuals resembling the Stevens family leaving the area. Under cross-examination, Gibson's credibility became a focal point. Defense counsel questioned her eyesight, her position relative to the orchard, and the consistency of her statements over time. They emphasized discrepancies between her early accounts and her later testimony before the grand jury. The defense suggested that publicity had influenced memory. Ballistics evidence provided limited assistance. Experts testified regarding the likely caliber of the weapon, but without the firearm itself, comparisons were speculative. The cut to Eleanor Mill's throat was examined in detail. Medical experts agreed it had been inflicted after death. The prosecution interpreted this as evidence of deliberate humiliation. The defense argued that without clear proof of sequence, such interpretation remained conjectural. Financial records were introduced to demonstrate the Stevens family's resources and influence. The prosecution implied that their status may have delayed earlier indictments. The defense objected to insinuations of impropriety, asserting that no direct evidence tied their clients to the orchard. James Mills, husband of Eleanor Mills, testified he denied knowledge of the planned meeting on 14 September. His demeanor was described as subdued. The defense did not present him as an alternative suspect, but emphasized the absence of proof connecting the accused to the victims that evening. The letters found near Eleanor's body were presented to the jury. Their intimate tone was undisputed. The prosecution argued that their placement near the body indicated staging by someone wishing to expose the affair. The defense suggested that Mills herself may have carried them to the meeting. Throughout proceedings, the prosecution struggled to present a cohesive timeline placing the accused at the scene. The 4-year delay between the murders and the indictments complicated recollection. Witness accounts varied regarding weather conditions, moonlight, and movement in the orchard. Defense counsel emphasized the compromised crime scene. They reminded the jury that crowds had gathered before police secured the area. Letters had been handled. Footprints overlapped. Early documentation was incomplete. The defense argued that uncertainty at the outset had irreparably weakened the case. The trial lasted several weeks. Public attention remained high. Newspapers reported daily testimony, often highlighting emotional aspects of the affair rather than evidentiary detail. The presiding judge instructed the jury to consider only the evidence presented in court. In closing arguments, the prosecution urged jurors to view the pattern of resentment, confrontation, and familial loyalty as sufficient to establish conspiracy. They argued that while no witness observed the act itself, the accumulation of circumstances pointed toward coordinated action. The defense countered that suspicion was not proof. They asserted that moral outrage over the affair had clouded objective assessment. Without direct evidence, without a weapon, without reliable eyewitness testimony, without uncontested physical traces, the standard of reasonable doubt had not been met. On the 3 December 1926, after deliberation, the jury returned verdicts of not guilty for Francis Hall, Henry Stevens, and Henry Carpenter. The courtroom reacted audibly before order was restored. The acquittals ended formal prosecution. The verdict did not declare who had committed the murders. It affirmed only that the state had failed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. Legal resolution was achieved, but factual clarity remained absent. The orchard where Hall and Mills were found had provided no definitive answer. In the courtroom, the burden of proof heavier than suspicion. The trial concluded, but the central question endured. The acquittals of 3 December 1926 concluded the formal prosecution of Francis Noel Hall, Henry Stevens, and Henry Carpenter. No further indictments followed. The state did not pursue additional charges against other individuals. The Hall Mills case, legally speaking, was closed. Frances Hall returned to New Brunswick and resumed private life. Though acquitted, she did not escape public scrutiny. For years afterward, her name remained associated with the scandal. She continued to live in the family residence and maintained social connections within the community. She died in 1942. Henry Stevens returned to business activities. Public commentary regarding the Stevens family fluctuated over time, alternating between suspicion and acceptance of the verdict. No judicial finding implicated them in wrongdoing. The acquittal stood without appeal. James Mills, widower of Eleanor Mills, withdrew from public view. He lived quietly and died in 1949. Eleanor Mills' reputation remained entangled with the circumstances of her death. Newspaper coverage of the trial often framed her as central to the moral scandal, a portrayal that persisted in retrospective accounts. The orchard in Franklin Township gradually lost its notoriety. The crabapple tree, under which the bodies had been found, became an informal landmark for visitors during the years immediately following the trial. Eventually, the physical site changed with development. The setting that had drawn national attention became part of ordinary landscape. In the broader context of American legal history, the Hall Mills case became notable for several structural reasons. First, it illustrated the consequences of an unsecured crime scene. The presence of crowds before systematic documentation compromised physical evidence. Objects were handled, footprints overlapped, and the original arrangement of letters could not be verified with certainty. These deficiencies limited forensic reconstruction. Second, the 4-year delay between the murders and the indictments complicated witness reliability. Memories shifted. Statements evolved. Allegations that surfaced years later faced scrutiny regarding accuracy and influence. The case demonstrated how time alters evidentiary clarity. Third, the proceedings highlighted tension between social status and public perception. The prominence of the Stevens family led some observers to question whether influence had delayed prosecution. Others viewed the eventual acquittals as evidence that the legal standard of proof had been maintained despite publicity. The case did not resolve that debate. It preserved it. Unlike earlier cases that shaped forensic science, the Hall Mills investigation did not produce methodological advancement. Instead, it exposed limitations in early 20th century investigative practice. Ballistic analysis lacked precision. Scene preservation protocols were not rigorously enforced. The handling of evidence reflected procedures that would later be revised. The trial also became an early example of media amplification shaping public narrative. Newspapers reported extensively on personal relationships, social background, and courtroom exchanges. Headlines emphasized scandal. Editorials speculated on morality. The intensity of coverage influenced public expectation long before jurors rendered verdict. Historians and legal scholars have revisited the case periodically. Some argue that the Stevens family likely confronted Hall and Mills, leading to fatal violence. Others suggest the possibility of unknown assailants motivated by jealousy or resentment unrelated to the accused. No alternative theory has been conclusively established. The absence of conviction left the central question unresolved: who killed Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills? The legal record affirms only that the state failed to prove its case against the individuals charged. It does not identify another perpetrator. Over time, the Hall Mills murders have been remembered less for forensic detail and more for the intersection of religion, scandal, and class. The case occupies a place among early 20th century trials in which moral judgment and legal evidence diverged. St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church continued its parish life after 1922. the institution endured beyond the scandal that briefly defined it in national headlines. Yet the association between the church and the orchard remains part of local historical memory. The crabapple tree no longer serves as a gathering point. The orchard has faded from immediate recognition. What persists are archival transcripts, newspaper accounts, and the preserved letters that once lay scattered beside a body. In the end, the Hall Mills case demonstrates the limits of reconstruction. Evidence disturbed at the outset constrained every subsequent conclusion. Testimony given years later could not restore what had been lost in the first hours. The verdicts of 1926 brought procedural closure. They did not provide narrative certainty. Between accusation and acquittal, a space remains, defined not by mystery alone, but by the boundaries of proof. In that space, the Hall Mills murders continue to reside, a case concluded in court, yet unresolved in historical memory, where scandal endured longer than evidence, and where the orchard yielded silence that no testimony fully overcame.